Good day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion on carbon markets. My name is Rumbi Chakamba. I'm an associate editor here at Devex, and today I'm joined by Bruno Hugel, senior advisor at Central African Forest Initiative Secretariat, Gilles Dufrasne, a policy officer for carbon pricing at Carbon Market Watch, as well as Yamide Dagnet, Director of Climate Negotiation at World Resources Initiative. Thank you guys for joining me. So, Article 6 is going to be one of the big topics for discussion and negotiations at COP26. And many people are expecting a resolution from this, and we're not sure if that's going to happen. Yamide, what are we expecting in terms of Article 6?
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. What we expect is for this particular set of rules to help countries to deliver and to design more ambitious actions, to deliver them more effectively and at a faster pace. And it's going to be very important for this to happen that the rules are very robust, because if not, they can do the reverse. It can undermine the ambition that we need to see towards 1.5 and be not credible enough to create the trust that the market needs and also a wider stakeholder needs to see on the ground.
Thank you so much. And Bruno, so there have been quite a few sticking points in terms of Article 6. Can you take us through those? But can you also just break down what Article 6 is?
I will rather put the perspective basically from the European countries and in terms of carbon markets, and for sure the needs in terms of finance are absolutely huge, and public finance is definitely insufficient. So the private sector finance is necessary in that sense. And carbon markets may be a key enablers to do that. But an important thing that is to take into account from the developing countries' perspective is that basically a stable and predictable financial resources is absolutely essential. And basically there are really huge questions regarding a fair and stable carbon price, with the idea that basically a $5 per ton of carbon is definitely insufficient. And developing countries really need the stability and the predictability, which can be an issue in terms of with the market's volatility. So again, in terms of transformational policies and basically the transformational agenda by the governments, there is really a need to be able to get really substantial funding to support basically that transformation. But again, with quite a predictability and clarity over the long term. So that's definitely a big issue. Another one is the complexity of managing basically the high environmental integrity that is required for the system to work, and basically making sure that there is a clear rule book to avoid all the kind of issues associated with double counting or double financing, and basically the issue of safeguards at multiple scales. So really, that clear rule book from the UNFCCC is absolutely essential to have really to avoid further fragmentation, different rules that developing countries have difficulty to deal with, and really aligning the subnational with the national initiatives, with the national reference frameworks. So that's really a big issue that needs to be settled within these negotiations.
And Giles, this isn't the first time that we're negotiating this. This has been ongoing. Can you take us through the history of these negotiations?
Yeah, exactly. Hello to everyone. I mean, it's been now over 5 years that countries are negotiating the rules for Article 6, so establishing or regulating new carbon markets. And of course, this is part of a broader history whereby carbon markets have been existing under the UN system, under the Kyoto Protocol for over a decade now already. So there is a significant amount of experience that countries and also private sector actors have accumulated in how to engage in carbon markets. But unfortunately, the experience so far has been quite negative. I think we have to draw the line on the markets from the past, on the clean development mechanism, which clearly has not delivered on the promises and has not really contributed to any significant emission reductions. What's also very clear is that it has been very unequal in its geographic distribution as well. And we see, for example, that very, very few projects have been developed in the African continent. And so what we really hope and needs to achieve is to break from the past and mark a clear break between the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement when it comes to carbon markets. And so this means not only not carrying over and not continuing with the old credits and the old projects that come from the previous system, so not meeting new targets with old credits, but also making sure that we learn from the mistakes that we have made under the Kyoto Protocol, and that we do establish a robust system, as was mentioned by the previous speaker, that there is no double counting, that we review rules around environmental integrity, social impacts. So we do have a basis to learn from, and we this is what we should be doing to establish the new system.
So one of the things that you've mentioned, Gilles, is like the unequal access. Yamide, what can an agreement mean for developing countries now?
Yes, this is an important question. I think there's two things. Again, let's remind ourselves why we are even here, at this COP. It's about keeping 1.5 alive, so really ratcheting up and accelerating our path on mitigation side, but also with solidarity and making sure that countries are resilient to even a 1.5-degree world. So a good outcome on this market mechanism, could be first that those vulnerable countries is that, those participating are really playing the game right. There's a level playing field. Nobody is given a free ride, and it contributes. It's not just an offsetting trading mechanism, but it really results in additional action. It's about better, more, faster action. And as Gilles said, history shows that we cannot, it's easy not to get that. So this is why, the rules needs to be so robust. The other dimension for vulnerable countries is that solidarity and resilience aspect, because they are demanding for, that the revenue generated in using this market mechanism to go to the adaptation fund to help them to be more resilient to the market mechanism. And then what vulnerable countries and communities are also asking is to make sure that based on the lessons from the past, as alluded to, that it does not undermine human rights. It doesn't have an adverse effect on indigenous people. So these are three elements. And for that, credibility, transparency, and accountability is going to be really important. And this is linked to also the process of transparency, to make sure that there's a way to not only look at how countries are reporting, to understand clearly what is going on. And you've seen that you heard a lot of announcements made, but there were a lot of discussion as to what does it mean? Is it real? And this is why transparency and accountability in those matters. And yes, so I think, linking the transparency agenda, and the use of market mechanism is very important.
Thanks so much, Yamide. You mentioned three things there that are really important: credibility, accountability, and transparency. Bruno, are we seeing these things within the Article 6 negotiations? And what support can we give to vulnerable countries and developing countries to actually make sure that they're able to make use of this?
I think you're touching at an absolutely essential point. I mean, we have to recognize that this is complex, and actually that developing countries have very different capabilities and readiness status for that. And so it's absolutely essential that carbon markets are not trying to replace the need for public finance, because that public finance will be a catalyzer to actually help the countries being ready for this, to deal with this complexity. To deal with all the reporting requirements from implementing carbon market initiatives at different scales, from the national level to actually the subnational local level. it's really, really complex and difficult. And working with countries from Central Africa, we can see definitely a very different status in terms of readiness with, for example, some Latin American countries. It will be really absolutely essential from the international community to support these countries to be ready and as Gilles was mentioning, being able basically to capitalize on these new opportunities. And so it's really about how to make sure that we can balance that the very high integrity that is environmental integrity that is absolutely essential for the climate with the very varying capacity from the countries with the idea of not leaving countries behind, basically.
Yeah. Gilles, one of the things that you mentioned earlier, not in this conversation, was that it's not worth having a deal at any cost. Do you still believe this is the case? Because this is as much like a political negotiation as it is. Do you still believe that this is the case? And what are we willing not to sacrifice in order to have a deal on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a very important point. And first, it's important to understand that the Article 6 negotiations that are taking place here at this COP are not about establishing a new market, but rather about regulating trades which are already authorized under the Paris Agreement. And so in that sense, it is important to have an agreement because we do want to regulate those trades. But having said that, we don't think that carbon markets or the trade of international emission reductions is really kind of a sine qua non condition to meeting the Paris Agreement objectives. And having a market that is badly regulated, that maintains loopholes, that, for example, allows double counting, that allows the use of old credits to meet new targets, this, in a sense, gives cover and legitimacy to countries who would want to exploit those loopholes. Having an agreement and having sort of, let's say, UN label on the system that allows these countries to exploit the system really creates the problem that it makes it harder to explain, I think, to the general public, to civil society, to media, even to policymakers, why it is not acceptable to use this system. And that's why having no deal is better than having a bad deal, because we don't want to have a market that has the legitimacy of a UN agreement while really leaving the door open for lots of abuses. And so one of the things that really cannot be agreed to, or that really should not be part of any final Article 6 deal, is the allowance of double counting, because this is not a negotiation about ambition. It is not a negotiation on what exactly we're going to do. It is really a discussion of, are you allowed to cheat or not? And if we set up a system where countries or entities are allowed to cheat, it just doesn't make sense. As soon as we start counting emission reductions multiple times, then the whole kind of Paris Agreement and NDC framework falls apart, because you have targets that are met on paper, but with no real reductions that matter to the atmosphere. And so this would really be a system that doesn't work, and we'd rather have no deal than a system that allows for that, even for a short period of time.
I love that you mentioned that word cheating, because double counting is essentially just cheating. So Yamide, can you please explain this concept of double counting and how it can be manipulated and what the risks are to the current climate goals? And are you also of the same agreement that it's better to have no deal than a bad deal?
Let me really confirm that I totally agree with Gilles. There's a lot of risk in not getting it right, and it's better, not to have any rules, but to set, standards that would actually undermine all the efforts and be contrary to the goals of the Paris Agreement. We acknowledge that if we do not have the right rules, if we don't agree anything, there's going to be a risk, because there is a voluntary market that is already put in place. But this is very important to get right in any case. The second, to your second question, let's imagine that you do have two countries cooperating. One country A is buying a credit from a country B that has more potential to reduce emission. You don't want, when we look at those two countries, to see that both of them claim that emission reductions one would be cheating, one will have a free ride, compared to the other. And when we would do, and if you imagine that several countries are doing the same, what we're going to assess collectively will not be representative to what the atmosphere sees. So this is just to illustrate, the stake of having corresponding adjustment, basically adding or subtracting, whether you're a seller or a buyer, to make sure there's no double counting, there's no double claiming.
And I'm imagining that the accounting of all this is going to be so essential. How difficult is it, Bruno, to account for these credits?
We cannot really emphasize enough the complexity of that, actually, and especially working for myself on the forest and land use sector, it is extremely complex, and we see that already with the voluntary carbon market that works especially at the local level, and where basically the methodology that are being used to actually define the baselines and account for the emissions reductions. The methodologies are vastly different from those used at the national level under the UNFCCC. So the big risk is to end up comparing basically pear with oranges and really having something that is not adequate. So it's really about being able to work across scales, so really from the local to let's say the subnational, provincial level, etc., up to the national level. Acknowledging that depending on the schemes and initiatives we're talking about, there are different standards, different methodologies, and that basically that's really complex to actually manage and really requires to work with registries at the national levels and a regulatory framework that is in place. And again, that requires a lot of capacity building, and not all countries are at the same level. So again, that will really requires substantial funding to actually support the countries in being able to set up that kind of framework. And sets again the question as well of, for example, countries like least developed countries, LDCs, and basically all the question of corresponding adjustments in the context of LDC that have taken quite very ambitious commitments, emission reduction commitments, without necessarily all the time the understanding of the real opportunity cost behind, and questioning their ability to actually meet their own commitments before actually supporting others as well.
I'm so glad you mentioned capacity buildings. Gilles, would you say that efforts are being made to build this capacity for less developed countries? Is that already happening, or is that something that we need to see happening?
I would say that this will be a start in that. There are some efforts ongoing, and there have been useful exchanges between developed and developing countries on trying to reinforce the capacity. But it is also definitely a major request from developing countries, and I think a very fair one, to have a dedicated program to have capacity building to ensure that the developing countries can actually engage in those markets. Otherwise, there is indeed the risk that mostly those countries which have the ability and the capacity to navigate these complex accounting systems will be the ones who can engage in trading, and who are typically also larger countries or the more developed or those that are growing faster and have a bit more capacity. So that's definitely a very important component of the discussions. And I think it's probably one of the elements where there's a bit more agreement within the discussions, of saying, yes, we do need capacity building. It's in the interest of everyone that all countries can engage in this. So hopefully that can be agreed in the end. And then I just wanted to comment also on the previous point of accounting. I mean, I fully agree with the comment that accounting is very, very technical. It is not easy to ensure the avoidance of double counting. However, we also need to keep in mind that the discussion today is very much happening also at political level, where some countries are not even trying. So it is complex, and we do need to have very specific systems in place to avoid double counting. But in order to have those systems in place, we need countries to cooperate. And today we have some countries that are saying, actually, there is no problem with double counting. We are allowed to count the reduction which we have already sold. And so we should not fall into the trap of saying, well, actually, it's very complex, and so let's take the time to figure out how it works, etc. we first absolutely need a political signal and agreement that says we do not want to allow double counting and we will account for that. And we can have a work program or further exchanges on how to really operationalize it from the technical point of view. But what we're missing right now is the political agreement to avoid double counting. And that is just, frankly, quite ridiculous on the part of those countries that oppose it.
Yamide, so Jill spoke about countries manipulating the systems and sort of like consciously manipulating the system. Is there once if an agreement is made, is there any repercussions for that, or?
So I think this is a very good point, and let me come back on the issue of capacity building. Actually, it is linked to what what has been said previously. One area that needs to be really enhanced, because we had the experience of carbon markets with just developed countries, and I think the challenge, and we know already that there's been challenges, and that if not done right, it can undermine the system. We already know that. So imagine when we expand from 40 countries to 200, and that many of those countries do not necessarily have, the structure, to all the registries and all the data and the accuracy of the data to make sure that we can do this. So capacity building is really important to get the transparency framework, the data and ambition loop right, to really get there. Now, what we hear already during this COP, some countries making announcement and we just don't understand whether it's true ambition or not. We heard some, right? Whether they are using a different baseline than the previous one. So, there's different ways to get away. And this is what we need to really address with those negotiations. So whether, and that's even beyond, the accounting of credit. So let alone with this. And I think the market overall would like to see good standards to respond and to really push forward the innovation that would be needed. And yes, at the moment there's not a lot of consensus, as Gilles said, because some countries are very much entrenched in their own interests, and some corporate interests are also making it more complicated as well. So I think we cannot be naive, but we just need to push for what we also know needs to be done to really get to where we need to be.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. Bruno, could you please explain what how corporate interests are playing a role in this negotiation?
For sure, the whole point behind the carbon markets is to make sure that basically there is support for more emission reductions at a lesser cost, and for sure for a lot of those corporate interests. The point is really to make sure that they're able to actually achieve the emission reduction that are required for them at the lesser cost. And again, not necessarily with the same understanding on how the rules work and the same capacity behind. So again, it's really, really important to make sure that there is a fair field level where basically all the different parties are supported to make sure that they can understand their own interests, what's feasible and not feasible, and not let the other ones get away with the better deal. So that's really essential in those complex discussions.
And as we're speaking and we think of things like accountability and we think of things of capacity building, a question just comes up for me, and Gilles, maybe you can answer this one for me. Are we actually ready for an agreement? We are talking about getting an agreement done this year at this COP, but are we actually ready for an agreement?
I think an agreement would really signal the start of a new phase of the work, right? So the work on Article 6 and establishing a new carbon market does not end with an agreement, whether it's at this COP or in the future. And on that, I mean, I think it's probably a bit of a now or never point today. But even if we do have an agreement today, it basically means the detailed work the technical work is starting. We will have to develop the capacity of developing countries. We will have to develop methodologies, accounting rules, safeguards. That will be a very important point to develop that has been crucially missing in the past to ensure the avoidance of negative impacts at local level. And so all these things really need to be operationalized going forward after an agreement comes. And so anything that might be agreed here is really the start of more work.
So an agreement is only the starting point, but does it mean that certain countries will be able to make use of this agreement before others? Yamide, I'll pass that on to you.
Well, some countries would be ready before others, to really make the most of such an agreement. And this would be the case for developed countries because they do have the experience of the Kyoto Protocol. Under the Kyoto Protocol, you had, some countries who were not ready. And I think this linked to the question that you asked me earlier about, whether there's going to be some compliance mechanism. We used the transparency framework, the measurement, reporting, and review process in the past, to really flag when a country, didn't have the infrastructure, the institutional framework, and that the data sets were not trustworthy, to put a flag, and that this country may not be in a position, to participate in trade agreements, because that could really distort or undermine, the robustness of, the process. And because of that, some countries got their capacity enhanced, did some, actually double their efforts to get ready to embrace, this market. And I think here under the Paris Agreement, we would have to use the transparency framework, the review mechanism, but also the facilitative compliance, committee. There's less stick, more carrots. Probably it's more facilitative than it was under the Kyoto Protocol. But to really still incentivize and build that capacity, because we're growing so much at such a bigger scale of participation. So yes, I just wanted to to insist, and I think Gilles is totally right. That I think we are now going from treaty design, rules design, to maybe more rules, but implementation. And we will see probably also more pilots. And actually, some countries have started to pilot some aspect of those rules, like Switzerland with Senegal, with Peru, with a few other countries. We may see more piloting so that we also learn more, to make sure that we go into the right direction.
Thank you so much. And unfortunately, we're now coming towards the end of our conversation. But just to summarize, I just want from each of you, are you expecting an agreement this year? And what would you like to see in there? Key elements. I'll give you guys each a minute, each starting with you, Bruno.
I hope there will be, definitely. We see, as Gilles mentioned, basically there is already a lot of things happening on the ground, and we see that actually the pace is accelerating. So it's really time. It's really essential that we have that rule book and that roadmap ready as soon as possible to actually provide the necessary framework to make it work fairly. So yeah, it is necessary.
And Gilles?
Yeah, I think an agreement is, let's say, is definitely more likely than it was maybe a month ago. So there's definitely willingness to get to an agreement. There are many things I would like to see, but just to limit it to three, maybe I would like to make sure old credits from the past are not used to meet new targets, new NDCs. I would like to make sure we have accounting rules that do not allow any sort of double counting, and also that human rights and the rights of indigenous peoples are properly reflected, are promoted and protected within the text and in the later operationalization of Article 6.
Thank you so much. And you, Yamide?
Well, I am also hopeful, but not at all costs. I think that was, said before. So if we're getting something that is weakened, we will need to be ready also to call it out. But I just hope that countries will remain focused to bring coherence with the set of decisions, that it's going to support reaching 1.5, keep resilient, with it, with the solidarity and cooperation that we need, and the credibility and accountability, to make this happen. And more work to be done after that. But yes, we need to have those foundations. So this is what I am looking for.
Okay, thank you all for joining me for this fascinating discussion. We'll definitely be on the lookout for that agreement to see if all these things are incorporated within the agreement, and to watch out for the work that starts after the agreement. Thank you guys for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.